going live on time. All right, and we are live. Excellent. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the OUSSG's 4th week event, and this very normal Tuesday where certainly nothing else is going on. Today, we are excited to welcome Daniel Fiott, who is the Security and Defense Editor at the EU Institute for Security Studies, where he analyzes European defense policy, CSDP, defense capability, and industrial issues, as well as hybrid threats. He is the Institute's representative to the Executive Academic Board of European Security Defense College, and he's also the author of the EUISS's annual publication, The Yearbook of European Security. Today, he'll be speaking to us on European defense in a time of global change. Daniel, take it away.
Well, thank you very, very much for the introduction, and hope everyone can hear me and see me as well as possible. I feel slightly honored that the Strategic Studies Group has invited me on such an auspicious evening, where I find myself almost competing slightly with Vice President Biden and President Trump. So that's probably not good for my ego at all, but nonetheless very, very honored to have been given the invitation. And in fact, I was originally invited last year, but of course for various reasons, and then the pandemic, that sort of went away. So I'm very happy to be here and to share some thoughts with you. I think it's quite an excellent question that's been posed, but it's also very broad. So we should begin, I guess, by starting to first define what we mean by Europe in all of this, because it can mean different things to different people. Europe in its, I guess, traditional sense can be classed or defined as the collection of European states, geographically defined, as it were. Also, of course, NATO, which includes a whole range of European states as well. And the European Union layered on top of that as well as an institution, not traditionally associated with defense, it must be said, but one that is increasingly taking seriously security and defense policy. So what I think is important to keep in mind here is that I will probably bias my talk more towards the EU, but I will indeed, of course, touch, as the organizers have asked me to do, on European security a bit more broadly, and also some of the global challenges that Europe's facing. I think there's a second word that needs also unpacking slightly as well, and that is defense, because sometimes it's not clear what we mean by defense. I mean, I think in a NATO sense, traditionally it has been clearly defined as the security of the alliance, and by definition, security in terms of continental deterrence, so the physical protection of allies within, again, a territorial space. I think in the EU, however, and even in NATO to some degree today, the concept of defense is being enlarged in scope, and that's being primarily driven, I think, by a number of the security challenges, which I'll go on to discuss in a bit. But what's happening to the term defense is that it's moving beyond just a simple protection of territorial homeland or of the alliance, and has started to include or increasingly be defined as the kind of internal-external nexus, to use a bit of the jargon here, where we see issues like border management, cyber security, the protection of critical infrastructure, natural disasters. All of these types of issues tend to get blended together. And I guess no better, no tragic example of that can be seen from yesterday's events in Vienna, where not only do you have counterterrorism police and intelligence officers on the beat trying to find terrorists, but then you have special commando units, which are normally thought of as, fighting in far-off lands, deployed to the streets of Vienna. So I think that's probably the most recent example of where you get this blending of defense and the stretching of the term, as it were. So once these two definitions, I think, are out of the way, it's also important to touch upon of the core themes that have arisen in European security. And I won't say they're new themes, because I think they've always been there, and new trends that they've always been there in European security, but they have, of course, I think, have become more aggravated under the presidency of Donald Trump. And also, I think, some of the broader security challenges that Europe faces, in particular with regard to Russia in the east, and also with the rise of China. So when we talk about Europe's position in a changing world and also changing security concerns, we also have to think about some of the structural reasons for why that is the case. And one of the major trends, which I think we are still contending with, and people are waiting to see how that will play out after the election in the US, is also this notion of European strategic autonomy, or even, as some people are now calling it, European sovereignty. What this basically boils down to is the realization by Europeans that they may not have been able to rely upon the traditional security guarantee offered by the US. So it's been driven by a degree of insecurity, the presence of the US on the territory of the European Union and specifically through NATO, and also a bit farther afield if you look at, for example, the EU's strong attachment to the multilateral order and how that's been affected over the last 4 years with the Trump administration. And it's not just the US, of course, it's also the rise of China and some of the questions and pressures that also raises for Europeans. And if you look, for example, at debates about the 5G discussion, for example, you see very, very clearly there in Europe a growing realization that what should seem like a rather harmless technological innovation or development gets wrapped up immediately in concerns about security, privacy, issues to do with espionage, sabotage, and the whole package. So I think if we're thinking of European security today, it's certainly the US questions over US leadership, and also the rise of China, and then I guess a bit more closer to home in Europe's neighborhood in particular, the role of Russia, and that also deserves a bit of some commentary in the sense that we have usually thought of Russia's activities, at least in the post-Soviet era, as being a kind of disruptive power in the eastern flank, and particularly its seizure of Crimea in Ukraine. But I think today we contend with a slightly different Russia. We have NATO reassurance measures in the east, of course, but what we see is that Russia has also a footprint in Syria, quite a substantial one, in fact, and also in Libya. So it is becoming not just confined to the eastern flank, but is indeed growing as a threat and a challenge more broadly around Europe. I guess you could add, but in a different way to that, the recent role of Turkey as well. And Turkey, you know, a lot of people focus on Trump, but I think Turkey also should deserve some focus in terms of the disruptive nature it's having in European security. For two reasons in particular. One, because it slightly echoes what the Russians have been doing with moving out of their immediate region. And of course, even today, you see Turkey in places like Libya as well, and also has a strong hand in the ongoing conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. But you also see that within NATO, it has the potential to cause political deadlock. And in fact, I think that's one of the reasons why when French President Macron spoke about the alliance somehow being brain dead, which is not a customary French term, by the way, but the idea that NATO is brain dead really rests on the notion that it was lacking effective leadership. And that was on one hand, yes, the US, but it was also, I think, driven by the fact that Turkey could play a kind of spoiler role within the alliance and kind of disrupt its cohesion. So I think principally, we're talking about US, China, Russia, and to some degree, Turkey. On top of that, we can also layer, I guess, some of the broader trends and themes. I think at the moment, especially in Brussels, one of the things that is taking up a lot more time from a security and defense point of view is the long-term challenge of climate change. And I say this to be humble in the sense that we recognize it's a problem at the EU level. We're just not very sure what to do about it from a security and defense point of view. It's true that in the Commission writ large, we have initiatives like the Green Deal, which is supposed to deal with the European economy itself. But beyond that, I don't think we've really got a handle on the long-term consequences of what climate change could mean for European security, especially given that most of the fragile states and those states that are, let's say, vulnerable to climate fragility and vulnerability are on our doorstep as well. And that, of course, gets mixed up in a whole other range of issues such as migration as well, which of course we know from a European point of view is also quite a challenge. Of course, I couldn't say anything about global challenges today without speaking about COVID as well and the pandemic. Again, here there is a great deal of uncertainty. What I can say is that at least from the NATO perspective and also from the EU perspective, a lot of work has been done to make sure that at least military personnel have played their role in delivering, medical equipment and also shipping people across the border if needed. But the problem here is the longer term challenges or security dilemmas that it might raise. And there are two principal ones. Firstly, I think it's a question of money. We simply don't know at the moment how our economies will be hit in Europe. And we don't know what type of effect that will have on defense budgets at the European level. And this is a critical time because the Europeans are saying, and especially regardless of who wins in the US elections, the Europeans are saying that they need to take on more responsibility for their own security. Now, we're woefully behind on capabilities. And the only way you can really develop those types of capabilities is by having long-term investment. And if that suddenly disappears because of the pandemic, because it may go to other areas of the economy, rightly or wrongly, it will leave quite a big budgetary black hole in Europe. And just to give you an order of the magnitude, I mean, we Europeans roughly spend about 200 billion euros a year on defense. And that's not a small amount. That's quite huge, actually. But we've only got to that stage because after the 2008 economic crisis, financial crash, we saw even in the space of a few years, order of the magnitude of about 14 to 20 billion being wiped off within the space of 2 years of that crisis. Now, COVID is not the 2008 financial crisis. So it could be exponentially worse than that. And of course, that means that we have to contend with the fact that we might have less money to play with for defense. Now, early signals, at least today, are pretty positive. If you look at France, if you look at Italy, and also the Netherlands, they've all made pretty big statements about how they're going to keep their defense spending going, even in some cases increase. But it's more the longer term trend that we should be worried about. I think the other aspect related to COVID is crisis management more generally. I mean, we simply don't know what type of aggravating effect COVID will play in some of the more vulnerable countries in our neighborhood. And I think specifically here in places like the Sahel, but even more generally in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East, where there is perhaps less capacity to deal with the fallout, the economic fallout and the security fallout. And we also have to keep in mind, of course, that for many countries that have normally tried to respond to structural crises such as a pandemic, they could normally or historically fall back on oil revenues. Well, today, of course, that's also very, very difficult for them because the oil price is on the floor almost, and so it's very difficult for them to plan in long term without eating into their reserves that they already have. So what we don't know is what type of crises will emerge on the back of the pandemic. We don't know what type of crises the pandemic will almost instigate. You can almost feel or taste the fact that in some cases, COVID might be used as a pretext by certain groups or even certain governments for crackdowns, for more authoritarian kind of tactics and so forth. And we also know that terrorist groups are licking their lips at the type of instability that might come out of inability to deal with the pandemic long term. So. Of course, I can't cover every single security issue facing Europe at the moment, but you see that it is not a rosy picture. And unlike the US, we don't tend to have the oceanic buffer of the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans to kind of protect us from the type of flows that come over borders from such crises. So I would say that the security situation for Europe is not very healthy at all. It's not very healthy. Sorry, that's not a pun on the pandemic, but it's just the reality of it, I guess. And all of this insecurity, when you put it together, is having a big impact on the way Europeans are thinking about security and defense more generally. Now, what I have noticed and what's quite interesting, at least within an EU perspective, is also the change in narrative and the type of questions being asked by leaders at the EU level. It started actually under the last term with the former Commission President, Jean-Claude Juncker, who started talking about the fact that Europe could no longer be a soft power, that it needed to somehow become a hard power and not be so naive in international relations. So what I guess he was trying to do was push back a bit on Robert Kagan's idea that the Americans were from Mars and Europeans were from Venus. Juncker thought that we should be a bit more Mars-like, at least in a rhetorical sense, if we can put it that way. The new HRVP, well, he's not exactly new, he's been in office for almost a year now, but he has also spoken about the fact that Europe needs to learn the language of power again. So again, you get this idea of power. The current Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has also spoken about a geopolitical commission responding to geopolitical challenges in the world. So the rhetoric has started to change. Also, another thing that has been really, I would say, pushed by or amplified by the pandemic also are new terms. Not just strategic autonomy, but sovereignty seems to be one of the key words. And there is almost, and maybe I can let you into some insider information here for Brussels, if I can, but it is quite astounding to me someone who watches, run around Brussels trying to rub the words or strike a line through the word strategic autonomy in many of these conclusions because they find it so distasteful, at least in some states. And the compromise position is that they start to agree on language such as sovereignty or independence. And I don't know about you, but for me, I find independence and sovereignty a lot stronger than strategic autonomy. So what we find at the moment is a proliferation of terminology, a proliferation of narratives. We also have counter narratives as well, it should be said. I mean, Directorate General Trade and the European Commission have also developed their own concept called open strategic autonomy, for example, which is supposed to, push back at the idea that somehow that strategic autonomy implies protectionism, especially in the trade realm. And so not only have we seen a proliferation of language and some very, I think, sometimes complicated and certainly contested terms, but there's another thing which has happened. And that is that there has certainly been a realization, at least at the EU level, that we can't pick and choose what we mean by sovereignty, so by strategic autonomy. So it can't just mean security and defense. Today, when we talk about strategic autonomy or even European sovereignty, the notion is actually that it applies to much more. So it applies also to health. It also applies to critical supplies that we might need protection. All sorts of things like this, even protecting against the interference of elections. I mean, even in the last few months, we've set up a new parliamentary committee in the European Parliament precisely on the idea of countering foreign interference. And all of this feeds into a kind of larger idea that the Europeans are going to have to fend for themselves a lot more in the world. Now, there are some who probably look at maybe an incoming Biden presidency as a reason to kind of throw out these concepts out the window, strategic autonomy and sovereignty. And that, of course, is born by the idea not only that they want a strong transatlantic relationship, but also that maybe we can go back to the kind of free rider pattern where the US kind of picks up the bill, the tab, and also is always there watching over us. Well, I think there is also a realization that even if Vice President Biden were to win the election, there are certain trends in US politics which nonetheless still forced Europeans to do more. And the one particular one which is important to keep in mind is that the US has shifted its center of gravity to China. And there seems to be a kind of bipartisan consensus on the China question. Now, we've been contending with this even under the Obama presidency. It's nothing new, of course, and Asia means that there is probably less US political and military bandwidth to deal with security in Europe and certainly in the neighborhood. So when it comes to places like Sahel, even in the Middle East, Libya, there is a growing realization, at least in Brussels, that the US is not going to be there necessarily to help us with these questions. Now, that's quite difficult for Europe because of themselves have very, very different opinions on how security and defense should work. So if you look, for example, at some of our Eastern member states and allies within NATO, they're very concerned that there could be a long-term US trajectory out of Europe. And they are very concerned as well that anything we do, maybe at the EU level, or if we keep on talking about strategic autonomy or even sovereignty, that this somehow will help a self-fulfilling prophecy in making sure that the US definitively leaves the Europeans to their lot. There are others, of course, who see this as a bit of an opportunity for Europeans to take more responsibility for themselves in their neighborhood and for their internal security. But of course, without the US pressure, without US leadership trying to deal with some of those discussions between the differences of opinions at the EU level, there is also a realization that a disinterested US will mean that the member states themselves are kind of exposed to some of their idiosyncrasies when it comes to European defense. And of course, if you see a country like Germany in particular, they see themselves very much in the middle here, of recognizing that there needs to be much more responsibility for their security and defense, and for Europe in particular, but also making sure that they don't completely try to sever ties with Washington. Now, I've spoken for 20 minutes, but I think maybe it's also important then to give you a little bit of a flavor of maybe some of the specific discussions within the EU when it comes to security and defense, because one of the consequences in defense is that it's allowed the EU to play much more of a central role, and the member states themselves have supported that role, if I may say so. So in 2016, we had the so-called global strategy, which was developed, a very long document, which I'm sure everyone has read word by word, line by line. But essentially, to give it the shorthand of the strategy, essentially what it tried to do is not only update the European Union vision of the security landscape, which had been updated since 2003, by the way, and it also wanted to set a process in place whereby Europeans could, beyond the strategy document, start to structurally engage with their security and defense. So once the global strategy was published, we had a whole series of new initiatives developed, and perhaps you're pretty much kind of aware of them, and I certainly don't want to bore you to death with the alphabet soup of acronyms that is associated with defense. But initiatives such as permanent structured cooperation, the development of the European Defense Fund, also having a kind of EU command center for some of its military. And these types of initiatives, without giving you too much detail, what they really amount to is a kind of structural change in the way we do defense at the EU level. So there's much more focus on member states trying to live up to commitments, to binding commitments. There are many more capability projects and programs themselves, whether they're funded by the European Commission from the EU budget, or whether they're developed in permanent structured cooperation between member states, and also with the idea of having a kind of central command center for missions. Perhaps the EU, even in its institutional landscape and its financing mechanisms, more geared towards trying to enhance the union's autonomy. What we've realized, though, and this is the work for the future now, at least at the EU level, what we've realized, though, is we probably moved a bit too fast when it came to all of these initiatives. I mean, just to give you an idea, we set up maybe, I don't know, 5 or 6 or 7 new initiatives in the space of a year. And then afterwards, people had to kind of rub their chins and think how all of these initiatives would fit together. And also, we had produced all of these new initiatives without answering a more burning question, which is what, in concrete operational terms, does the EU want to be able to achieve when it comes to its defense? We've never really answered that question. And to the degree that we did, we answered it at the beginning of the millennium when the world was very, very different indeed. So we have over the next year with the Strategic Compass Initiative, as it's being called, a real opportunity, firstly, to try and get the member states to see what they see as the most pressing threats for the Union. And secondly, then, to be rather more concrete about the types of operations and military actions that the EU should be able to do. And that will be really important, I think, because any incoming US administration will want to, I think, have quite a clear message from the Europeans about what they intend to do over the next 4 years, at least from the EU side. And I think when we talk about autonomy, at least one of the interpretations, and that was stressed, I think, a day or two ago by the German defense minister, was that we need to take on more responsibility. It's just not possible. And I know that Europeans have been saying this for decades, year in, year out. Every time a new US president comes along, we always say we want to take on more responsibility. But there is a growing awareness that time is being called on unquestioned US support. And also it's changing domestically in the US anyway, away from outright support for European security. So things are changing, and we need to be able to send a very clear message and develop the type of capabilities we need in order to be a much more responsible defense player, at least in our near neighborhood. Now, the question of whether or not the EU has a role beyond this, beyond our near neighborhood in places like the Indo-Pacific, is a real question mark there. At least there seems to be some degree or political ambition to go in that part of the world, especially with the rise of China. And in fact, many of you probably saw a few days ago or even a week ago that we had for the first time even EU naval vessels and Japanese self-defense force Navy exercising together as well. It's a small thing, but it goes to show that Europe has a kind of schizophrenia that it needs to deal with, which is that we have internal security, the near neighborhood, and then there's the rest of the world, which is very, very important, and which if we don't have a response to, then of course powers like China might be able to wield unlimited influence and power in that part of the world. So it is not a good time, I would say, for European security. I think everyone would agree with that. And I also think that there is that the wind behind concepts such as strategic autonomy or even European sovereignty, if you want to go that far, the wind is not completely gone. Everyone is waiting for the next US election. But I think even if, let's say, Vice President Biden wins, I'm certain that the conversations are not going to be all peace and love. There will be some growing up to be done, I think, within the corridors within Brussels. And that's already started, as I've said. There's no other option, if I can put it that way. Of course, there is a conversation about what transatlantic cooperation should look like in the future, of course. And I won't say too much about that. But I hope at least over the last few minutes, I've given you a sense of what Brussels is thinking in terms of its security threats, security challenges, and also a little bit about some of the initiatives that have been developed. So I think I can end here. And in any case, most of the magic normally happens in the Q&A session. So I'm hoping for some decent questions from the floor. So thank you for listening to me, and happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much for your insights, Daniel. Okay, so we're going to open up the floor to questions. If you're in the call now, if you could please use the raise hand function or type something in the chat, we can do it that way. And then if you're watching on the live stream, feel free to type something in the chat and we can read that out too. Right.
I believe Wesley's raised his hand. Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Will Evans here from the...
I can hear you. I can't see you, but I can certainly hear you.
Okay, let's fix that as well. Okay. Okay. Hi.
Hello.
Hi, can I have a comment from you on the departure of the UK, obviously two of the most significant military powers in Europe, from the EU, and what that means in defence terms, particularly for France, the other remaining all-spectrum military power. So, and France has aspirations inside the EU for defence, particularly on industrial strategy with Germany and others, but also has its own very strategic bilateral relationship with the United States. So, comment on how the French are going to play post-Brexit defence conversations inside the EU, please. Over.
Thanks. Okay, so I'll respond to them as they come in rather than as in groups. No, that's of course very, very good. I mean, on the Brexit side of things, of course, EU level probably couldn't have happened without Brexit. If we're serious, I mean, initiatives such as the command center for CSDP missions and operations was continuously blocked by London for fear of it kind of duplicating a shape at NATO. And even PESCO, probably one can have a big debate about whether or not PESCO would have been feasible with the UK still in the European Union. Probably on initiatives like the European Defence Fund, I think probably the UK would have supported that and probably would have pushed for a more open interpretation of where the money could go, given that its own industry is a bit more exposed and dependent on the US market as well, and also with partners like Sweden. In a way, the UK leaving has kind of given a certain energy to EU defence. And if we're honest about its immediate impact on CSDP, which I know is a very small part of European security more generally, I would say that from an operational point of view, it has not been such a huge disaster, because traditionally the UK have always played a very relevant but still very, very small part within CSDP more generally. Now, to your point about France and the UK, I think you're spot on there in the sense that we've even seen it over the last few days with the kind of marking in the calendar of the Lancaster House agreements, that when it comes to the operational side of things and deploying force, that France still has an extraordinarily close relationship with the UK. Then, as you rightfully say, on things like capabilities and industry, it tends to Europeanize that a bit more within the EU. I think that France have played actually quite a pragmatic role here. I mean, even during the Trump presidency, I think there was quite a good understanding struck up between President Macron and Donald Trump. And I think to some degree, although, I mean, you can always question this, of course, the US almost looked at France as its more natural partner, at least to try and influence the EU side of things, and even within NATO as well. So I think France and the US have come to some kind of interesting accommodation. We'll see how that develops if the presidency changes. And I think also then, if you look at what France has done outside of the EU framework, so in particular with the so-called European Intervention Initiative, I mean, it was very clear that France wanted not only like-minded states to join it in terms of its, or to find like-minded states that almost aligned on its expeditionary DNA in its military, the UK being, of course, one of the more prominent partners there, but it also was quite pragmatic in designing a structure which would allow the UK to play a role without necessarily getting tangled up in the EU side of things, which, as we know, is very complicated at the moment because of the ongoing negotiations. So, of course, we have to see beyond the negotiations what kind of relationship the EU and the UK will have. I think your point that you raised right at the beginning of the UK being the only other military power that has a kind of culture and capabilities of deploying, that's clearly correct. And I think that is recognized from the European Union side as well, that it is a huge military partner to be losing. So we have to see what happens there. But I would also say that in another way, it's been, the paradox is that it's been quite helpful in exercising minds in the EU. And I think we'll see a lot more of this actually in the coming years, where the emphasis has to shift back to operations. So if it's not possible for the EU to deploy military operations, to have that kind of expeditionary kind of reflex in defense, then I think there's already a realization amongst a lot of states that if we can't deploy, then where is your credibility? It can't just be founded on industrial programs and capabilities. You need to be able to use force for that. So in a way, having the UK kind of leave has focused minds also on that dimension of the conversation as well. We have to see where it goes, of course. You know, historical kind of foibles always come out when you start to discuss the use of force, military force. What I think is very, very clear, however, and I can say this because, I'm here in Brussels. I have a lot of proximity to the system. Conversations about EU army or starting up an EU army is just a mere fallacy. We're not anywhere close, and I can definitely assure you no one really has the willingness to embark on that route. I think from a very basic level, the EU recognizes that it needs a certain degree of credibility when it comes to security in its neighborhood. And we have not had that so far. And I say this given that we've had, 20 years of CSDP now. And it's very difficult to point to an operation where you can say, yes, that was quite a robust force. Maybe back in the day with Operation Artemis, which was probably one of the more robust military deployments that we made. But since then, it's not been possible. So there is an ambition to get to that level where the EU can deploy, and then that would really would not be so rhetorical, and it would be built more on a kind of realistic platform. So UK is very, very close. It will be very interesting to see what role or what relationship the UK will strike up also with the US, depending on how the election goes as well. So yeah.
Great, thank you so much. We've got John up next. John, if you'd like to ask your question.
All right. Well, thank you very much. This is very interesting. I was very much looking forward to this. I have two related questions. First, I'm still sort of struggling with this idea of strategic autonomy. Why, at the time, did member states go along with this, knowing that it's a massive overstatement and about sort of anything that could realistically be achieved, and knowing that sort of there were very little ambitions to actually sort of then start the projects that would put us even close to there. And the second question would be, how would you evaluate the growing role of the European Commission in security and defense, managing the European Defense Fund and being able to use the budget on a few other initiatives? Why was this done, and how do you think this will evolve? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Two excellent questions, John. Thank you. I didn't see your face, but excellent questions. First, on the strategic autonomy side of things, I mean, it depends how you look at it, right? If you're looking to use the term strategic autonomy as a definition of the present situation, of course it looks ludicrous because we don't have strategic autonomy in defense. That's the reality today. If you define it more as an aspiration, then it becomes a bit more realistic, I think. And what I've said also during the time I had speaking was that a lot of these initiatives were developed to give member states that additional push, that additional space in which they can try to develop their capabilities together to enhance their strategic autonomy. I think, though, today it becomes, as I said, it becomes much more complex in the sense that when you talk about strategic autonomy, normally it applies to such a broad array of EU policies today, Eurozone, trade, health, critical supplies, all of these areas, that it becomes more a question of defining strategic autonomy in the main, so as a total sum of what the EU does. Why it emerged? I mean, to some degree, personality counts a lot here, and also a kind of reading of the strategic situation. You have to keep in mind that in 2016, when the global strategy was developed, when it was published, first of all, it was published in the same week as Brexit, as the decision by the UK to leave the EU was made. That, of course, had huge alarm bells, as I said in response to the last question about potential risks and also potential opportunities. We didn't foresee at the time of publishing the global strategy that Donald Trump would be elected as US president, but that kind of allowed for a retrospective justification of using the term. That there was a genuine fear, and especially in many member states, even those, it must be said, that traditionally had not really been too attracted to the idea of having more European autonomy, suddenly realizing that perhaps it might be a good idea to hedge their bets. I mean, let's also not underestimate what has happened in the last 4 years, especially with the kind of ripping up of the INF Treaty, Open Skies. you name it. I mean, the whole architecture in Europe of security has starts to fall down beside us. And I should also say that when the global strategy was published, it was also in a response to many years of turmoil for the European Union. There was the financial crisis in 2008, which took a huge slice of the EU's financial power away, and also not just financial, but politically. If you remember back in those days, with the discussions about debt restructuring and so forth, not a very nice time. There was the so-called Arab Spring in 2011, Russia's seizure of Crimea, migration crisis in 2015, and then Brexit in 2016. And it's no surprise to learn that the first words in the global strategy are, we're facing, an existential crisis as a European Union, and there were genuine fears that the EU might be somehow on the rocks, as it were. So strategic autonomy was one of those concepts that you could kind of rally around. I think now it's become much more contested because I think politicians and also academics in particular may use it out of context sometimes. So there's not so much precision when we use the term. And it is one of these concepts that is very persistent. That's all I can say. It doesn't go away. And it's I don't think it will go away as well. I mean, there are states that genuinely see autonomy as a laudable ambition. And there are those that dislike it. But what is quite interesting is that, at least in my position where I can speak and meet with member states, even though they have a huge disagreement over the terminology that we use, they're all pretty much on the same page when it comes to the Europeans needing more capabilities to spend more on defense and to be more robust actors. That can be in the EU, that can be in NATO, and that can even be on their national defense. So I don't think there's a real debate on Europeans wanting to do more. It's just the rhetoric and the language that seems to muddy the waters, as it were. On the second point on the European Commission, I mean, this is probably one of the more historic or unlikely byproducts of the EU's foray into defense over the last few years. And it came about, I would say, by a huge degree of political leadership by Jean-Claude Juncker. I mean, it is quite extraordinary that normally, when it comes to Commission policy, you have a kind of bubbling up from the bottom-up approach where you have a policymaker who has a fantastic idea. It then gets moved up within the hierarchy, gets presented to the higher echelons of the Commission, and then they see if they can make it work. The EDF, as we're told, now come up with the fine print. So it was a real interesting case study of the kind of hierarchy leading on this. Secondly, it was also historic, as you know, because it was the first time that we could allow the EU budget to fund defense, which was taboo until this point. It was just a no-go area, and all of a sudden something changed. And again, that would probably point to some of the answers or some of the responses I gave to the first question about the need for more autonomy, the need for Europeans to do more. That changed minds and focused minds very, very pointedly. I think there was a real shock. Now, what is interesting about the Commission's step into defence, very frank here, it is an impatience. I mean, they look at the European defence landscape. They see, as I've said, that the Europeans spend about 200 billion euros a year on defence. But what do we get for that money? We get duplication, we get a lack of interoperability, and we also lose out on trying to develop some of the more high-tech, cutting-edge technologies. So what the Commission have done, have tried to break through that barrier by saying we're going to present you with a new financial incentive scheme to kind of break this traditional pattern of European security. With that, of course, you can always argue that the more you finance things, the more power you get within the institutional setup. And it is fair to say, I don't think anyone can deny this, that some member states have also looked over their shoulder at the role that the Commission can play within European defence. And if you look, for example, at the current negotiations for the money for the European Defence Fund, you see there's quite a disagreement about how much money should go into that pot. We started off with a request of about 13 billion. Today we're at about 7-8 billion. We have to see where we are on that. So it is It is a new area for the Commission. It has certainly ruffled feathers. But I think now, if you look at how, after the dust has settled, I think member states now naturally look at the European Commission as an important partner now in defence, but specifically on the kind of industrial and capability side of things. Where the Commission lacks competence, even in a legal sense, not in an intellectual sense, is that they don't really have the structures for planning for defence. I mean, they can't really tell you what type of technologies you would need for what type of operations. For that, you do need the other part of the house, the more intergovernmental part of the house, under the EAS and also with the kind of military planners. You need that system to kind of gel together between industry capabilities and operational and doctrinal and strategic elements of the defense planning cycle, as it were. And we have a very disjointed structure at the moment, which we're trying to work on to make sure that all of these pieces fit together. So European Commission, very interesting actor. It's also very interesting today, perhaps, to learn that even within the new DG that they set up, DG DEFIS, for defense industry and space, they're also employing a lot more people today, a lot more experts who understand defense procurement, who understand capability development, and also they have responsibility for space. So one of the things that the Commission is looking at now as well is to increase this kind of synergies between space, defense, and also the civilian sector, because technology in those domains cross over so easily. So it's about trying to use the EU budget and the financing mechanisms that the Commission has. And to be quite honest, the Commission has financing mechanisms pretty much everywhere. And it's sometimes very difficult to know which could apply to space, security, to defense. The hard work is bringing it together. But the Commission ends up being quite an important actor now in the defense landscape from an institutional point of view, but also funding and thinking about defense capability development. A very radical shift.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to read out now a question from our YouTube live chat. So DH asks, should Europe collectively engage in peacemaking, force projection situations in their near neighborhood, like in Artsakh and Nagorno-Karabakh now? And if so, through which structural and institutional vehicles should they do so?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, of course, before you decide to deploy anywhere, I mean, there are a whole bunch of political factors that go into it. I mean, in particular, it becomes a lot more congested today to just simply say, yes, we have capabilities, let's go and deploy in this part of the world, principally because you have third powers there now, such as Russia, Turkey. You even have proxies, you have the existence of terrorist groups and so forth. So it becomes much, much harder today to think about intervening in the first place. I mean, Libya is probably a case in point, but then also so is Syria. And I guess now there is no appetite for any kind of military response to what is going on in Azerbaijan and Armenia in that war. But however, on the idea of peacekeeping and peacemaking, all of these types of military tasks were written into the DNA of the EU. I mean, the so-called Petersburg tasks that were developed in the mid-90s and went on to be written into the treaties after the millennium was specifically pointing to the EU to be able to undertake these types of tasks. So let's say hypothetically, if the political situation were more amenable to it, we could probably see a kind of EU type development or deployment being planned for. That's what the EU was set up for as a crisis management actor. As I said, we've kind of been woefully behind when it comes to being able to have the capabilities to do that. But at least from a conceptual point of view, those are the types of military operations that we should be planning for. The EU does not have any planning competence, as it were, for dealing with, for example, nuclear strategy or repelling a Russian conventional attack in Europe. That would be more for NATO. But outside of that, Europe, in its near neighborhood, far neighborhood, has a kind of legal basis in the treaties and the planning apparatus to try and plan for these types of deployment. But again, it comes back to the fact that even if you're the most capable military actor on the planet, you would still have to think about the political consequences of intervening and how you do that. And for the EU in particular, it's given way to this idea that you can't always use military force for every single crisis. I mean, that was and also dealing with Afghanistan as well, that you needed something more than just military force. So what the EU has tried to do is try to perfect what they call, it's a rather clumsy term, but the comprehensive approach of bringing together civil and military tools in one specific crisis situation. And that's really the EU approach. It's not a kind of send in the Marines type approach by the EU. It always has to be a kind of blending of the two.
Thank you. We're going to move now to James, who has a question for you.
Sure. I was wondering, a lot of your writings are about the sea, and can you comment on the NATO nuclear sharing in the CSDP, and will that change with the withdrawal of the UK, leaving France as the only independent deterrent?
Yeah, it's a very timely question, I will say. It's also one that the French have been rather cautious about, I would say. I mean, they realize that they are now the only nuclear power within the EU. And if one reads the probably one of the most important speeches any French president will give on France's nuclear deterrence, they kind of left the door open for a discussion, as it were, on this. But they didn't push it too much because, of course, for France, nuclear deterrence is so core and central to their national autonomy, to their national strategic autonomy. And we always have to make a distinction here between European strategic autonomy and French strategic autonomy. And there are some guiding lines in French defense policy which, that even they would probably not be very happy to Europeanize them overnight, at least, let's put it that way, that there's a very cautious approach. Now, I think you saw even in a speech a day or two ago by the German defense minister, who kind of pushed back on the idea of nuclear strategic autonomy in her speech by calling it a kind of illusion. And I think that that's fair. I mean, most member states in the European Union are not open to the idea of discussing the nuclear umbrella. It's the word that dare not speak its name in at least in one half of Brussels. In Evere, where NATO headquarters is, they're using it all the time, of course. But in the EU context, we're very, very cautious. And also, it's about reality as well. I mean, could you imagine the lack of credibility the EU would have if we started talking about nuclear deterrence and nuclear sharing in an EU context, when we can't even get CSDP right after 20 years and deployments, normal conventional deployments right? So I think that we have to start off the discussion from a realistic basis here. But of course, it touches on a core point of strategic autonomy. I mean, I've written about this as well, as you say, that, if you take strategic autonomy to its logical consequence, then it would also assume that the Europeans have autonomy in the nuclear dimension as well. But for all sorts of reasons, I don't think that that's on the cards anytime soon, because before that you would have such disintegration of voices and interests in states within Europe and the alliance that it would be unmanageable. And I think for the US, of course, they know that the nuclear umbrella, the nuclear guarantee, is ultimately what keeps the Europeans in check, so to speak, when it comes to security and defense within Europe. So it's not on the EU's agenda. It is an interesting discussion. And I can tell you, again, just to give you a bit of a vision of what goes on in the inside, whenever I meet colleagues in the military branches on the EU side, we tend to laugh at these, these types of reports, because we know how far removed they are from the reality of what we're trying to do at the EU level, which is, let's first make sure that we can deal with the level of ambition that we've set ourselves, and then we can see where it goes from there. Obviously, a lot of it is, the discussion is contingent upon international shifts as well. And so, I think we have to be a bit cautious about entering into that type of discussion. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Miriam.
Hello. Thank you very much for speaking to us this evening.
Hey.
Now, I remember early on in this pandemic,
Pleasure.
when the COVID outbreak first reached Italy, there was a distinct lack of a coordinated EU response. And it seemed that states were just doing their own thing when it came to health security, things like closing borders and screening visitors. So my question is, what lessons do you think have been learnt from the pandemic in Brussels? And does it have the potential to bring states in the Union closer together? Or do you think it serves to highlight their differences when it comes to their approaches to security?
Yeah, that's an absolutely excellent question, and one which is actually exercising a lot of or expending a lot of brain power at the moment at the EU level, because it is fair, and no one can really dispute this, that at the beginning of the crisis, the EU was found wanting, if we can put it this way, because national governments were doing what national governments normally do, which is to retreat behind national borders, to try and put the shutters up, the barricades up, and try to deal with it as best as they can, especially given that this is a virus, so something that travels very, very quickly and over borders. So that reaction was difficult to deal with. But on the other hand, the EU does not have a competence for these types of crises. So it has actually given much more space to have a discussion about what type of authority, what type of competences, what type of institutional structures we might need at the EU level to deal with these types of cross-border crises. Now, what I can tell you is that it's not as if at the EU level and in institutions like the European Commission and the Council that they have not planned for these types of crises. I mean, a pandemic is not a black swan. It is something that we always thought would happen. And it is not as if we haven't planned for it. We have. It's just that legally speaking, the competences rest with nation states, with member states. So, of course, we have to now think about, what appetite there is to maybe transfer or share some of these competences at the EU level. And I think if you see one of the less reported initiatives which the Commission wants to take forward, it is the kind of revision or the, let's say, evolution of what's called the civil protection mechanism. So the one tool that we do have at the EU level that is supposed to deal with these types of cross-border crises, I think we will see in the future much more resources being put into this mechanism, and also a much more central role, so that when we do have health crises such as pandemics, that the EU will be better prepared for it. Of course, and I think embedded in your question, there is a core point here. Have we learned anything from the first wave or the first lockdown to the lockdown that we're heading into now? Well, that's an excellent question, and it's probably more of a test for member states to see if they're open and have the appetite for cross-border cooperation. I must say that at the moment it seems to be a lot better than it was the first time round. So there has already been a lot of cross-border support given to, for example, the Czech Republic in particular. And other countries that have, it seems like the crisis response is a bit more manageable now. We've had a bit more time to stockpile some of the types of equipment that we need. And it has also given, I think, a much broader discussion and comes back again to this concept of sovereignty, more than autonomy, European sovereignty, to have a discussion about the kind of critical supplies we need in Europe for the safety of our citizens, right? So if you're not able to have face masks, if you're not able to procure them in big enough numbers, then you're failing. If you do have them, but you can't get them across borders because of all sorts of national regulations and because of kind of national selfishness, then you're also failing. So I think it has given rise to a lot more thinking about what more we can do in these types of crises. But of course, it takes time, and also it needs the member states to agree to the idea of sharing more of their sovereignty at the EU level on health issues. So we will see how the response goes. Hopefully, the second wave won't be as tragic. And it can be a bit more manageable. But on the other hand, we have to make sure that the response mechanisms are fit for purpose as well. So,
thank you, Daniel. I have a question myself now, if I may. You spoke a bit about the potential issue of credibility in institutions like NATO if the US is no longer being seen as an effective leader. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, first of all, whether you think that it's actually feasible in the short-term future for Europe to be free of the US, so to speak, in terms of conducting their own defense. And if so, do you think that would put European initiatives for defense in a competitive rather than cooperative relationship with NATO, since, of course, right now it's described as being cooperative and complementary rather than two competitive organizations? Thank you.
Yeah, two excellent questions. I mean, I think firstly, I would caution or push back about the idea of somehow replacing or cutting free from the US. I don't think that is politically desirable, and I don't think that it is feasible in the short term. The simple reality is that in terms of having the right kind of capabilities, and even beyond that, even having the political institutions that can decide big questions such as the use of force, that is not going to happen overnight for the Europeans. So we are in a bit of a gradual approach, I think, to trying to develop at least, first of all, the political institutions that we need to be autonomous, so we take our own decisions about any kind of hindrance. And then secondly, develop the type of capabilities we need for our own level of ambition. But that level of ambition doesn't stretch today to, for example, cutting away, as I said in the other question, cutting away from the US's nuclear umbrella. And in many, many cases, I think there is a realization that when we talk about autonomy, if the Europeans are more capable of defending themselves, then it's more likely that the US in the long term is going to see the EU as a credible partner. It can't see the EU and Europeans as credible partners if it's always having to carry the can for Europeans in a financial sense and also in a military sense. So I think that it's not a question at the moment of thinking about cuts or breaking free, especially not from the EU side. I mean, there was a fear over the last 4 years or so that the idea of cutting loose would come from Washington rather than from Europe. It's not something that we would have wanted, but it would have been something that would have been inflicted upon us. And in such scenarios, you still have to plan and think about what you would do in such a circumstance. Also because you would have, the sharks sniffing the blood in the water. Russia and other partners who would look upon that type of development as quite a shock in the West, in the Western system. So I don't think it's about breaking free, but there is a realization that this is a long-term structural change in the transatlantic relationship, and there therefore needs to be a long-term structural change in the way Europeans think about their own defense. Now, on the EU-NATO question, I think this is very valid. It has been there since the beginning, and you'll be familiar with Madeleine Albright's, three Ds, and the idea of a duplication or decoupling. That has always been there. It's not a new debate. I think it's also fair to say that the EU and NATO do different things, and they have different institutions and different capabilities for doing it. And one of the really interesting things, I think, has been a consequence of Russia's seizure of Crimea, and also the emphasis on hybrid or unconventional tactics in warfare. And there it was quite interesting because NATO was faced not necessarily with a kind of conventional defense or conventional deterrence operation. It was below the radar. And so it had question marks about what type of tools it had. And for the EU, okay, we couldn't scale up to the conventional force level and conventional defense. But when it came to things like dealing with disinformation, cyber defense, critical infrastructure protection, the EU started to say, well, we do have competence and we do have money and we do have institutions and policies that deal with them. So I think it really drove NATO and EU together on this trajectory to say, well, let's try and combine tools if we possibly can. Now, I think for the future, there is a legitimate question about what duplication looks like. So, for example, it's quite telling that for many years, at least on the EU side, we've been on the brunt of the idea that somehow we're duplicating by talking about some of the military defense tools that we've been developing, in particular the European Defense Fund and PESCO. But if you look at NATO today, they're talking about China's rise, they're talking about resilience. I mean, these are all concepts which normally, especially resilience, was more in the EU had. So there's always a question mark about who should be doing what between these two organizations. I think if you take away all of the political obstacles, so some of the friction that's been there with the US and also now the Turkey question, which causes considerable problems within the alliance, I think that the majority of members that share a house in both NATO and the EU recognize that there needs to be much closer cooperation between the two. And I can say from the EU side, that initiatives like PESCO and also the European Defence Fund, when we're planning on those capabilities, it's the member states themselves which insist upon the fact that we're not duplicating or creating kind of gaps between EU and NATO. So whatever we try to develop at the EU level should answer to national needs and should thereby extension also respond to NATO's own gaps that they've realized and also the capabilities that they need to develop. So it's a kind of difficult relationship, I would say. EU-NATO cooperation has done pretty well since 2016, I think. And now we also have to see what kind of influence any potential new person in Washington might have for that type of relationship, because I think there is a genuine willingness to try and cooperate a lot more between the two organizations.
Thank you so much.
Can I ask something?
Oh, pardon? Yes, go ahead, Greg.
I'd like to ask about the situation in the Middle East and how much does that inform your policy going forward in view of the considerably fractured nature of the Middle East and the continual migrant flows that are going on? I hope you heard that.
I think for the European Union, yes, I did. It came through loud and clear. Thank you very much. That's a good question. We, at the European Union level, realize, and it's probably one of the main areas where, US kind of disengagement in that part of the world, or a different type of engagement, has led Europeans to scratch their heads about that part of the world. And of course, the kind of fallout from the, as I said, so-called Arab Spring has also led us to some very serious questions about the effectiveness of our neighborhood policy as well. And some of the past kind of strategies we had about, to be blunt, throwing money at every problem without necessarily dealing with the structural concerns. Now, the Middle East, of course, I'm not a Middle East expert, but it is so interconnected. I often like it to one of those devices people have on their office desks, with the silver balls where you pull one, it hits the others, and they're all moving. A kind of chain reaction between member states. It is a very complicated part of the world. We try to engage with at the European Union level. I think if you look, for example, at the policies on Iran in particular, which have been very different to the current US administration, they've tried to be much more of a kind of diplomatic rapprochement with that part of the world. But I think we're still at the stage of trying to understand what the longer term trend for that region is for Europe as well. As I said, countries like Russia seem to try and get quite a foothold in that part of the world. You already know that they have naval bases in Syria, for example. We've also seen China now in Djibouti with their naval base. China also having much more of an economic and trade relationship with a lot of countries in that part of the world. And then the long-term structural challenges in that part of the world as well. Climate change and adaptability to that. And as I said earlier, oil prices and how far oil can support some of the economic models that have been in place there for so long. So what happens, for example, if there's a long-term crash in oil prices? Europe starts to move more towards renewable energies or importing fossil fuels from, say, the United States instead. What happens to the kind of collapse of that economic system in that part of the world? And you're completely correct that politics in that part of the world has a great bearing on things like migratory flows into Europe. It's also one of the reasons, incidentally, why the relationship with Turkey is so regrettable at the moment, because for the EU, it's quite a strategic player in that part of the world. And I think if you look at some of the tools that the EU have, they're not going to necessarily have a short-term impact in places like Syria or Libya. But certainly it is the case that there is a kind of long-term commitment to those parts of the world. Libya with its peace process, Syria also not so much an immediate response, but thinking about what reconstruction could look like at some point in the future. But we know as well that security for Europe kind of hinges on that part of the world, and it's also one of the reasons why for Europeans it's quite concerning to see kind of US signals that it probably has less reason to be engaged in that part of the world because it's less dependent on oil, but it's a bit more complicated than that as well. As I said, the shift to the Asia Pacific, but we have to be really careful there as well, because players like China see that part of the world as, and they'll approach it cautiously, but they see it as maybe an interesting case study of growing much more influence in the Gulf region as well, and in the wider Middle East. And for them, particularly important given the kind of Belt and Road initiative they have and the access that they need to Africa. So it is concerning for the European Union. We do have relationships with many of those countries, but it has a kind of uncertain future, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. We have a couple more questions for you here in the chat, if that's all right.
Sure.
Okay. So Renee Belletta asks, outside of the UK's role in NATO, what is the EU's expectation of UK involvement in European security going forward, such as the southern flank, the Mediterranean, Turkey, etc.?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I think at this moment there's not. We don't really have any well thought out demands to be made of the UK. I mean, the UK themselves will have to think a little bit about what type of defence actor they see themselves as, and what type of actor they want to become. And we see that process at least should have started, integrated defence review and all of this. But there are questions now that as the UK tries to develop capabilities and thinks about what capabilities it needs in the future, it will also need to take stock of its strategic position as a NATO, as an important NATO ally, but also in terms of its relationship with the EU. So I can't really concretely tell you what that would look like. I think that from the EU side, the issue of partnership is still very strong. Of course, we have to try and work out how that looks like in practice. But I think that in many areas, there would probably be shared interests between both the UK and the EU, which would have been there even without the EU, frankly. And probably areas of concentration. I mean, you say there, I think, southern flanks, so in the Mediterranean and Turkey. I think Mediterranean is probably one of the main areas where we could think, but I mean, most of the bandwidth will probably also be taken by the European partnerships within NATO as well, and thinking about the eastern flank in particular, and also about Russia as well. But beyond that, I mean, it's also quite interesting to think that, from what I see, the UK having certain ambitions also in the Pacific and in Asia as well, and thinking through there what type of partnerships they may want with the US and even other players such as Japan or even maybe Australia. But of course, the EU itself is thinking as well about what type of relationship it should have in that part of the world, or what role should play in that part of the world. So I think that those types of conversations can be quite interesting. But to be very frank, today it is just far too early to even contemplate that, because we're still trying to negotiate what the how the departure will look like, what the trade situation will look like. And I don't think you can really have a meaningful discussion about its kind of settlement is in place. But when the UK was in the EU, it was one of the main things that Europeans looked at the UK for, and that was the kind of strategic leadership discussion. And it had a kind of energizing effect within the EU. That is gone now, but still, I think there is a kind of pragmatism there. And as many of high-ranking EU officials have already said as well, that they're kind of open to having that kind of closest possible security and defense relationship. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question now from Hattie Schofield, who asks, how does the EU see China in its ambitions? As an adversary or as a country to bring alongside and help, for example, in operations in the Mediterranean or through information gathering? Is that conversation taking place in the EU?
With China? Did you say China? Sorry, I had a bit of a glitch. Okay, with China. Okay. Well, in terms of security and defense, not so much. I mean, that relationship is, well, there isn't really one, I would say. I mean, there's been exchanges, there've been kind of goodwill exchanges, especially when it comes to across one vessel to another. There's nothing structured there. I don't think there is probably any real ambition to take that much further at the moment. And particularly because the EU is trying to develop, I think, close relations with Japan in particular in that part of the world, and also looking at countries where a much stronger security relationship could be had, for example, with India, with Korea as well. So there are a number of partners that the EU tries to develop. Now, broadly speaking, the EU has played one could probably unfairly label it as a kind of ambiguous kind of approach to China. Whereas if you look at the strategy, EU-China strategy, we call China a partner, a competitor, and a rival in the same paragraph. And that is basically a kind of a fair reflection of what's going on. And that is that from a military point of view, from a security point of view, and in other areas, there are concerns about how China is developing, things like human rights and so forth. It's an adversary in other parts of economic and political life, the normal way of competing with each other on global markets. And it's true that China is still an economic powerhouse, which the EU tries to develop and compete with. And then as a partner, I think on issues, for example, such as climate change, there is a recognition that you have no option but to cooperate with China because they're so vast and such a big part of the puzzle that you, at least on climate change, need them on board. And the hope now, of course, is that the US can also be brought back on board, depending on who wins that election. So it is a complicated relationship with China, I would say. Many European countries have strong economic relationships with China, so that we benefit mutually from trade. That's true. But on the other hand, we start a kind of growing realization that there are inherent risks in the relationship with China as well, and we need to be very realistic and also very vocal about those risks as well. And I think that the EU has moved pretty fast in the last few years on treating China with a bit more suspicion. Now, does that mean that somehow there is a kind of, questions about how the EU fits within a kind of game between the US and China, or strategic game between the US and China? Well, of course, in terms of values, there's no question that the EU and the US are in the same boat. That's clear. But I think what the EU tries to do is to play a bit more of a mediator role between those two powers in particular, especially on economic trade issues. That's for sure. And it also tries to leave that kind of room for dialogue open. So I wouldn't necessarily at this stage put the EU in its entirety, especially in security and defense, as some kind of pole between the US and China. That's certainly not the case. But in the economic realm and on trade and on other areas, the EU does exert a great deal of power. And it is able to influence how US and China deals with each other. So it's ambiguous by its very nature. It'll be very interesting to see how it develops. But I think most EU member states are starting to question elements that they may have taken for granted in the China relationship in the past.
Okay, thank you so much. We're going to move to our final question of the evening, which will come from Clara. So if you'd like to go ahead.
Yes. All right. Let's see if people can hear me. Yeah. So we have been, thank you.
Hi, I can see you as well.
So thank you for a very interesting talk. We have been sort of regionally in the near regions. Now we were just regarding China. And I would just be interested if you could take us a bit to the Arctic and the high north. And so whether there is EU consensus on the role of the EU there, and whether there is easy to find consensus on an EU Arctic strategy in the defense sphere, And also then in comparison to the role of other strategic initiatives, such as JEF, for example, Joint Expeditionary Force, and other initiatives with more northern country focus, and how that relates to the actions of the European Union.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I don't think the Arctic really takes up, it doesn't have really much attention when it comes to security and defense. And I wouldn't expect anytime soon for the EU to develop a kind of defense angle to its approach to the Arctic. Mainly because, as you've said, I mean, it would be very difficult to get consensus on that within the European Union. And also because when you're talking about the Arctic and also the High North, there are only a number of states who can claim, first of all, geographical proximity to that part of the world, and also understand interests in that part of the world a bit better than maybe other parts of the EU. So I think that the general consensus from the EU side is that the presence has to be diplomatic. The problem, of course, there is that we need to think a bit more strategically, in the sense that we know that climate change is greatly impacting the geographical lie of the land. It's opening up trade routes and so forth. We also see that China and Russia are eyeing up that part of the world. So is the US, it must be said as well. So if the Arctic becomes a kind of strategic theater, which seems to be the direction of traffic, it must be said, then the EU needs to think about its overall approach. And there are many domains where this is the case, where the EU looks at an issue, be it the Arctic, also be it space, for example. It's another good example, where we try to look at it through only diplomatic lenses, and we try to stress the multilateral dimension of that part of the world, multilateral approaches, and we tend to forget the kind of strategic dimension involved there. It won't be easy to get any kind of political consensus on that, by the way, but I'm just trying to drive home the point that sometimes, when we say things like we need to learn the language of power, we need to become more autonomous, well, with that comes a kind of responsibility that at least you should be thinking strategically about parts of the world where maybe just diplomacy. So I would say from an institutional point of view, institutions have to be prepared in terms of their planning, in terms of strategic thinking, but it is ultimately the member states who put on the agenda what the EU should be thinking about and acting in terms of. So Arctic is one of those areas where for the foreseeable future, the EU will stress a diplomatic approach, and not try to move into a kind of defense side of things, I would say.
Okay, well, I think we're going to wrap it up here. So first of all, I'd like to say a huge thank you to you, Daniel, for this fascinating overview into such a complex issue of what's happening with European defense going forwards. And as well, thank you, as always, to our members for your wonderful questions, for the YouTube questions. If you've enjoyed this event and you want to join us next week, we'll be meeting at the same place, same time. We'll be having Dr. Susie Dennison speak to us about how public opinion reflects policy across Europe. So thank you again so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And thanks for the questions.